I'll be included stuff. My sense of it was that the British reneged on a huge level the promises to free slaves in the process.
No, they did renege in the following way, and this makes Cassandra Pybus's case. She has an article on called Jefferson's Faulty Math. But her line of argument, his faulty math was that on his plantation, 30 blacks escaped, and he said 27, I'm sorry, yeah, what is it? He estimated that 30,000 blacks escaped in Virginia, and that 27,000 of them died of smallpox and other things. And actually, his own figures from his farm book are that 30 slaves escaped from his plantation, and he thought 27 of them died. But of course, he was a fat-headed slaveholder, even though a bright man in other ways. And so every slave who escaped wanted the master to think him dead, or her dead, right? So the number who died, the number who died in British camps and other places, and of these diseases was huge, but there were a lot who got away. So anyway, the Prime Minister of London, Lord North, was no good. He was not an honorable human being. And they signed a peace treaty. John Lawrence was killed in a meaningless skirmish at the Combahee River, and his father had been imprisoned in the Tower of London and ended up being released in an exchange for Cornwallis and hustled to the peace agreement. And he wrote in the infamous Article 11.7, which the other Americans wouldn't have done. And that article said that the British must return slaves and other articles of American property with which they have absconded. Now, this was a total betrayal of the son, and probably the worst thing that Henry Lawrence ever did in his life, although there's several real competitors. So, and naturally, he is much praised in all of these books. Shama likes him, and the son is young, idealistic, hot-headed, etc. But there was General Guy Carleton, Sir Guy Carleton in New York, and he said, all these soldiers I found free when I arrived, and so they had to go wherever in the British Empire I could send them. And I cannot believe, he said both to Washington and to Prime Minister North, that we could commit you could expect us to commit a monstrous breach of the public faith by returning them. And Prime Minister North initially got mad, but then he said, you're right. It is a matter of justice and honor that we do this. So keep a list, which is how they made the list of the 3,000 in the Book of Negroes with some information, which unlike other people, I puzzled over both in the National Archive version and then in the Public Records Office version in London, which is somewhat longer. And then it turned out Graham Russell Hodges actually edited a book called The Black Loyalist Directory in 2003, so I actually have easier access than just puzzling, because what they wrote is almost, the inspectors who did this, is almost inscrutable. And so, but I figured it out by spending a lot of time puzzling over it. It has a huge amount of information. Anyway, Carleton freed these 3,000 blacks, and in the meantime got a lot of other blacks out. So the British, as Pybus says rightly, freed the largest number of people in any single effort in North America, including all the northern states, in that time, and took people out. And that happens to be true. It's too bad for the American Revolution that that's true. The American Revolution was a good thing. It's not a good thing in this respect.
I was just going to comment on the fact that so many Native Americans joined the British as well.
Amen.
Could you repeat the question?
Huh?
Could you
I was
repeat the question?
Just commenting on the fact that so many Native Americans also joined the British, so that you had African Americans and Native Americans who were joining the British.
You had the French and Indian Wars before, in which Washington fought, and they'd also recruited British and recruited slaves to fight for the men. And I found historic records. And so Washington knew this was always a possibility. The British mobilized slaves, particularly in New York and Canada. And the Americans did too. And Narragansett Indians in Rhode Island fought for the Americans. And so there was manipulation by both sides. It was, if I might say, an early version of inter-imperialist rivalry. And unfortunately. But the American story is particularly degrading because with black soldiers, initially the U.S. government wouldn't pay them. They didn't have any money. So that their pay, and a wonderful woman named Eleanor Eldridge, who was the daughter of one of these guys and the niece of one of these guys, another guy who fought in the Rhode Island Regiment, wrote a book, which I found. And she has the most marvelous description of this. She like this book. It's in the Rhode Island, in the Historical Society library. And she describes how they had the greatest thing, which was freedom. And she says, like a chrysalis coming out and becoming a butterfly. Blacks felt like this was a great thing. But of course, they didn't get any pay, so there's a big struggle. Jonathan Olney, who was one of the only family who was big in Rhode Island in this regiment, fighting here. And he led efforts after the Revolution to get back pay. And they didn't get back pay for a whole period of time. But by the 1820s, the U.S. government settled on blacks, patriots, or their descendants, because a lot of them died, income and land. And there was actually an unusually generous, in my view, settlement. I mean, like a, significant thing.
In Rhode Island?
Ohio.
Ohio.
Not that, I mean, out in the wilderness, but, it's land.
Right.
I mean, and it wasn't like land in Nova Scotia where the British hadn't prepared, and you couldn't grow nothing on the land, so everybody starved. And it was a very difficult scene for the blacks who went with the British. And a lot of suffering, a lot of struggle. So, but anyway, so the British actually carried out a lot of people, and Native Americans, however, were driven out by the American states. And a pretty consistent, although there was resistance to the genocide against the Cherokee in Georgia. I mean, it's very significant resistance. And of course, the British didn't treat indigenous people in Canada any better. And by the way, right now, indigenous people in Canada are leading the fight against the XL pipeline and also the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. And fortunately, they have some rights in Canada, so they're actually able to make trouble about this. But the conservative, so-called, the reactionary imperialist government of Canada, not as bad as here, but the reactionary, actually has promised the Chinese the tar sands will go into production and that it will all be shipped out, and that they're going to ride over them, and they're going to ride over with here. And again, with Obama, there's a huge push from below which stopped the original approval of this. But if Occupy and the push from below doesn't do it, we have already seen with Barack. Barack knows what's right. Barack really wants to be president, and he's the president of an oligarchy. So I'm all for re-electing Barack. Because, by the way, you get Romney, and I would say it's bad. But, having said that, Barack will only be any good if we push him. And that's, it's too bad, but that's the way it is. So, if anybody has illusions about Barack at this point, I would like to say, I like Barack. I think Dreams from My Father is a terrific book, but, yes.
Alan, thank you for a very provocative presentation. I have too many questions to take up the time tonight, but I want to make a public proposal.
Okay.
That you and I work out having lunch and conversation once a month, and then this time next year, the two of us make a presentation about the revolution and the post-war revolution and the beginnings of black political consciousness. Would you be willing to do that?
Sure.
Okay.
Maybe we can actually set it up not
So,
quite so distantly, and we'll have to work out the...
yeah, I'm going to work
I will
out
be honest.
us having lunch and doing some talking because I thought your presentation was really provocative. But there are a number of things that I want to talk about.
Well, anything you'd like to ask now?
Not really. I liked your response to the man in the front who said, did the British renege, and the British had a package that they offered to veterans, relocation to build their colonial empire, land and provisions, which meant anything from blankets to seed and farm utensils. And they offered it to the black veterans that they took to Jamaica, Nova Scotia, and there was a third place, I believe. But when the veterans got there, the locals weren't real happy to have a group of blacks who had military experience and possibly some political experience, and failed to give them the land and the provisions. And the British government in London didn't do much about it. So initially they gave them the same package, they just didn't push it in the same kind of way.
There's a whole, yes, there's a further complicated differentiated history. Because in Nova Scotia,
Yes.
they brought, the total was usually given as 30,000 Maya Jasanoff in the new book, Liberty's Exile says it's about 50,000 Loyalists who came. And lots of whites didn't get land, so they made no provision. And Governor Parr of the British Empire gave blacks less land, and many blacks, like Thomas Peters, got no land. And there were some blacks, like Captain Stephen Bluke, Colonel Stephen Bluke, who was fought in there was a black guerrilla movement. There was a group called Black Brigades in New York. Captain Todd, Colonel Todd, as he's often called, was the leader of this. Bluke was in it. And Bluke actually was the main one who the British favored, and they gave things to. And they actually gave a big plot of land to. But the others were driven out. And the whites who were egged on against them were poor whites, or they were loyalists, who also didn't get land. And so this is a very terrible situation. There were, however, whites, Christians, mainly Wesleyans, like Freeborn Garretson, who actually came. He was preaching to blacks and whites, and he would have rocks thrown at him and eggs. And he got this guy Boston King to become a minister, who preached, he's black, he preached to blacks and whites. And there was a significant anti-racist movement also in Canada. And then they mounted this movement to Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone, Granville Sharp in England, a white minister who was very abolitionist and a very smart political theorist, actually had suggested organizing a democracy. So they organized something much better, something they didn't have in Britain, a radical democracy with a shorter work week. And Clarkson, on the one hand, opposed the abolitionist company trying to impose quit rents on the settlers, which were horrible, very large, unheard of in the empire, quit rents. And he said this was no part of the deal, and we never said such a thing in Canada. But he was completely autocratic toward Peters and this democratic movement. So that sounds very different from Jamaica, where there was also a huge revolt in 1834. And so, anyway, we will talk about this. We will have fun.